So I read this story the other day, and it just cracked me up
Yeah.
about how in Norway, some guy ended up with beer coming out of his water tap.
Oh, wow.
And apparently the bar down the street couldn't figure out why their beer was so watery. It was just this like epic plumbing mix-up.
Wow.
But it really made me think about how important it is not just to know how to do something right, but to actually do it.
Right.
Like having the competence, but also the character to follow through.
Absolutely.
And that got me thinking about discipleship and how crucial good guidance and learning are for really just navigating life well.
Yeah. I mean, you think about it, that little plumbing mishap kind of highlights this human need that we have.
Right?
We all need direction, and we all need to grow and improve.
Totally. And that's what we're diving into today.
Yeah, that's right.
This idea of discipleship.
Exactly.
And I know when you hear the word discipleship, you might be thinking about like structured Bible studies at church.
Yeah.
Or maybe it feels like something that's just for new Christians.
Yeah.
Or maybe you imagine some super strict, almost like isolated kind of lifestyle.
Right. Or even just a to-do list.
Yeah, just checking things off.
Bunch of skills you got to learn or facts you got to memorize.
Right, exactly.
But we're going to kind of set those assumptions aside for a second.
But let's hit pause on those.
Because to really get what it means to make disciples, especially in our world today,
Right, in 2025.
we have to go back to where it all started
We got to go back
and understand what it meant in the first century.
to those first followers of Jesus.
Yeah, that's our goal today.
That's what we're doing.
We want to unpack what make disciples really meant back then.
Yeah, the original intent.
And more importantly, connect that to your life today.
Like, how is that relevant to me right here, right now?
Exactly.
Okay, so before we go back in time, though, it's important to remember that even before Jesus walked the earth,
Yeah.
this idea of passing on wisdom and shaping someone's character wasn't some new invention.
Right. It's a very human thing.
Like, think about it.
Yeah.
We all want to connect with people.
We need those relationships.
We want someone to show us how things work, to offer some guidance and support.
Like a mentor or a guide.
Exactly.
Someone you trust.
And it's not just about feeling good.
No, it's way more than that.
It's about achieving our goals,
It's about achieving your potential.
whether those are professional, personal, or even spiritual goals.
Absolutely.
And throughout history, mentors and guides have helped people overcome so many challenges.
Yeah, like procrastination,
losing focus.
giving in to temptation.
Those are universal struggles.
They really are.
So when we look back at how discipleship has played out in history, we can see how it really addresses these fundamental human needs.
Yeah, and those needs are relationships that nurture us, apprenticeships that help us build our skills.
Accountability, so we can stay on track.
That's so important.
The willingness to be shaped and to learn, and the wisdom to make good decisions.
All things that discipleship helps us with.
Exactly. And so, to really understand this, let's go back to the Greco-Roman world.
Okay, the cradle of Western civilization.
Exactly.
That's where it all started.
I mean, this is the time of guys like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle.
Giants of philosophy.
They were masters of teaching and learning.
And they used what we could call discipleship.
Right. They each had their own methods,
Yeah,
but they all saw the value in it.
totally.
And this wasn't just some niche thing either.
No, discipleship was everywhere.
This idea of aligning yourself with a master thinker, it went through every level of Greek society,
From the top to the bottom.
from the intellectuals to the everyday people.
It was the way to learn and grow.
It was the way to become who you were meant to be.
Right.
And even someone as brilliant as the Apostle Paul,
Yeah, what about Paul?
when he was in Athens talking to all those intellectuals on Mars Hill,
Yeah, the philosophers and thinkers.
he saw their spiritual curiosity.
They were searching.
He even pointed out that they had an altar dedicated to an unknown God.
Wow, they knew there was something more.
Right. And it shows us that even though they had these sophisticated systems for passing on knowledge,
Yeah, they were really good at that.
they were still missing something. They had the methods down, but they didn't really have a grasp on the ultimate truth.
The truth about God.
Exactly.
And that's where this Greek word methides comes in.
Which we translate as disciple,
Right, and it was used a lot in these Greek philosophical schools.
like Plato and Socrates.
No, they were big on it.
But for them, it meant learner.
Someone engaged in serious study.
And it also involved this idea of apprenticeship.
You submitted to the teacher,
You trusted their guidance.
and you went through rigorous training.
Right. You really immersed yourself in their way of thinking.
Totally.
So even before Jesus came along, discipleship was about committed learning.
Yeah, it was about going deep.
and following a master's way of thinking.
That's the key takeaway here.
It's about transformation.
Okay, so we've talked about the Greco-Roman side of things.
Now let's switch gears.
Where are we going?
We're heading over to the Hebrew world.
Right, the land of Israel.
This culture predates the Greeks and Romans.
Much older.
And while the Greeks were focused on abstract ideas of truth,
Yeah, they loved their philosophy.
in Jerusalem the focus was on Yahweh
The one true God.
and the anticipation of the Messiah.
The promised Savior.
So how did this concept of method, or its Hebrew equivalent, play out in that context?
Well, the main Hebrew word that corresponds to mathits is talmid,
Okay, Talmud.
which means taught one.
So it's very straightforward.
Yeah, very literal.
Someone who is being taught.
That's right. And we even see it in the Old Testament.
Oh, wow.
Like when Ezra the prophet is talking about the temple musicians, he calls them a community of talmidim.
Interesting.
So even back then, you have this idea of discipleship.
A group of people learning together.
And then there's another related word, limud.
Okay, limud.
The prophet Isaiah uses this word a few times when he's talking about his own disciples.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like he says, bind up the testimony and seal up the law among my disciples.
So he clearly had people who were following him.
Yeah, who are learning from him.
Interesting. And what else is there about limud?
Well, it also appears in Jeremiah, but there it's translated as accustomed to.
Accustomed to.
Yeah, like in that saying about the Ethiopian changing his skin or the leopard changing his spots.
I've heard that one.
It's basically saying you can't change your nature.
Right.
But what's interesting is that it highlights this idea that we all become discipled in some way,
We all learn from someone or something.
whether it's for good or for bad.
We're all shaped by what we're exposed to.
Exactly.
So the Hebrew language had its own way of expressing these ideas.
Yeah, so Talmud basically means taught one.
Taught one.
And limud emphasizes this idea that we all become shaped by what we learn.
So it's not just about the information itself.
No, it's about the impact it has on us.
It's about transformation.
Right.
Okay, so these Hebrew words, they really point to a personal connection, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
This idea of a master imparting knowledge and training a student.
It's a close relationship.
So it seems like ancient Hebrew culture may not have had these formalized discipleship programs.
Right, not like the Greeks.
But the language itself shows that this intimate teacher-student relationship was still really important.
Definitely. And it wasn't limited to any one setting.
Because it could happen within families.
Right, parents teaching their children.
Among the respected elders in the community.
Passing on their wisdom.
Or with the wise men.
Those entrusted with preserving tradition.
So even though we may not see the word disciple used as often in the Old Testament, the essence of discipleship, those core characteristics were still deeply ingrained.
Yeah, it was woven into their culture.
And the best example of this is the relationship between Moses and Joshua.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic example.
It's like the ultimate mentoring relationship.
It went on for decades.
And it shows us all those human needs we talked about earlier.
Those needs for connection, guidance, accountability.
I'm thinking about Moses. He was leading 2 million people through the wilderness.
That's a lot of responsibility.
He had to be carrying so much weight on his shoulders.
He must have needed encouragement.
For sure, and Joshua was right there.
As his right-hand man.
His dedicated aide.
Always ready to help.
And Joshua wasn't just there to make Moses' life easier.
No, he was learning.
He was actively apprenticing under Moses.
Observing him.
Watching how he handled crises.
And even witnessing his mistakes.
Right, like when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it.
Yeah, that was a big one.
But through it all, Joshua was learning.
He was seeing how Moses interacted with God.
And that's key, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just about learning the skills.
It's about learning the heart.
It's about learning how to walk with God.
That's discipleship.
And Joshua wasn't just a passive observer either.
No, he had real responsibilities.
He was accountable for tasks.
Important tasks.
Like managing the logistics of leading 2 million people.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it was.
And we also see Joshua's submission to Moses' leadership.
And to God's commands.
Even when faced with challenges.
Like when his own family questioned him.
Or when the spies came back with their report and everyone was afraid.
He stayed faithful.
His character was being shaped through these experiences.
Yeah. He was being refined.
And when the time came for Moses to pass on the leadership,
To hand over the reins.
God himself chose Joshua.
And Moses gave him clear instructions.
And then Joshua went on to lead Israel into the promised land.
It was a direct result of that discipleship.
You can really see the impact.
And it lasted even after Moses was gone.
Yeah, in Joshua chapter 24, It says that Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua.
Powerful.
And it wasn't just Moses and Joshua.
No, there were others.
The prophets also had this kind of following.
Like Isaiah.
He specifically mentions his disciples.
And Samuel.
He had a whole company of prophets under his guidance.
It was like a school of prophets.
And then you have these mentor relationships between prophets and kings.
Like Isaiah and Hezekiah.
Or Nathan and David.
Those were important relationships.
Sometimes they were challenging.
Yeah, they could be tough.
But they were crucial for the king's spiritual growth.
And for the well-being of the nation.
And we can't forget Elijah and Elisha.
That's another great example.
And Elisha then went on to lead a group known as the Sons of the Prophets.
It was like a prophetic community.
Maybe a way to support each other.
And to stand strong against the negative influences of the culture.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And then you have the wise men and the scribes.
The keepers of knowledge.
They were the ones who preserved and transmitted Israel's wisdom literature.
Like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes.
This wasn't just casual learning, though.
No, it was structured.
It was formal training.
With a clear master-disciple dynamic.
Like Baruch and Jeremiah.
Or the wise men who helped Solomon.
So this idea of a master-disciple relationship, it's woven through the entire narrative of Israel's history.
It's part of their DNA.
It wasn't just about getting information.
It was about developing leaders.
And making sure God's purposes continued from one generation to the next.
Exactly like passing the torch.
And now we come to the world that Jesus entered.
First century Palestine.
A place where apprenticeship was deeply ingrained in the culture.
Yeah, it was everywhere.
And there were all these influential religious schools of thought.
Each with their own passionate followers.
And to really understand what make disciples meant to those first followers of Jesus, we need to understand these different groups.
Because they were all part of the backdrop.
Okay, so let's start with the Pharisees.
The guardians of the law.
These were devout lay people who were super focused on protecting the law.
They were serious about it.
Both the written form and the oral traditions that had developed around it.
They had a lot of rules.
And they believed in the resurrection of the dead.
They were waiting for the Messiah.
They were very zealous.
Sometimes a little too zealous.
So you can't deny their commitment.
No, they were dedicated.
They paid close attention to everything Jesus said.
They were always watching him.
Analyzing his words.
Debating his teachings.
They were really bothered by him.
Because he challenged their whole way of thinking.
Like when he gave the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, they couldn't handle it.
They were furious. Because he said that their meticulous adherence to the law wasn't enough.
They thought they had it all figured out.
And they had these formal rabbinical schools.
With dedicated disciples.
Like an army of students.
Learning from their master.
Josephus even compared these young men to an army.
Wow, that's quite an image.
I know, right? And Gamaliel, the famous rabbi.
Yeah?
He apparently had thousands of disciples.
Thousands.
They wanted to learn from the best.
It was like a prestigious education.
Their system was intense. But if you succeeded,
you could have a very respected religious career.
You were set for life.
Wow.
Okay, so then you have the disciples of John the Baptist.
John the Baptist.
His message was all about repentance.
Turning away from sin.
Seeking God.
With all your heart.
And serving him wholeheartedly.
That was his focus.
And his form of Judaism was actually quite pure.
And very similar to Jesus' teachings in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It really is.
And John attracted a lot of disciples.
He was a popular teacher.
And some of them even became followers of Jesus later on.
Yeah, like in the book of Acts.
There's a story about 12 of John's disciples who come to faith in Jesus.
That's cool.
Yeah, and their lifestyle was very simple.
They lived in the desert.
It was almost like a semi-monastic existence.
Sacrificial.
They were willing to give up everything to follow John.
Okay, so we have the Pharisees and the followers of John the Baptist.
Who else is there?
Well, then you have the separatist disciples.
Separatist disciples.
Yeah, they were also known as the Essenes.
The Essenes.
They were disillusioned with mainstream Judaism.
They felt like it had become lukewarm.
And compromised.
They were disgusted by the spiritual lethargy.
So they withdrew from society.
They went into the desert.
Just like Jesus did later on.
And they devoted themselves fully to God.
It was a serious commitment.
They lived a very strict monastic life.
With tons of rules.
And it wasn't easy to join them.
No, they had high standards.
You had to go through a 2-year probationary period.
Wow, 2 years.
And then you had to pass an exam on your Torah knowledge.
It was like getting into an Ivy League school.
But their goal wasn't just intellectual understanding.
Oh, no. They wanted to imitate God.
And live in genuine brotherly love.
They saw themselves as the true remnant of Israel.
They were the faithful ones.
And they eventually settled in Qumran,
which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating part of history.
Okay, and then the last group we're going to talk about are the Zealots.
The Zealots.
These were messianic movements that popped up in response to the Roman occupation.
They were fighting for freedom.
They wanted to overthrow Rome.
And they would gather around a charismatic leader,
who they claimed was the Messiah.
the King of the Jews.
And they were all about military readiness.
They were preparing for war.
They weren't so focused on Torah study.
They were more focused on action.
And some of them even wanted to make Jesus their king.
They wanted him to lead the revolution.
But Jesus refused.
Yeah, he wasn't interested in political power.
He was all about inner transformation.
He knew that real change starts in the heart.
That's a powerful lesson.
It really is.
So when Jesus called his followers to make disciples, people would have had all these different groups in mind.
It's important to remember that
They were all part of the context.
So when Jesus said make disciples, not everyone would have understood it in the same way.
Right, because their understanding was shaped by their experience.
Like if you were a Pharisee, you would have a very different picture of discipleship than if you were a zealot.
Yeah, totally different.
So as Wilkins points out, discipleship was a common concept.
But the type of commitment
And the goal
varied dramatically.
depending on who you follow.
So it's a complex picture.
It really is.
Okay, so now that we have this first century context,
Yes.
let's zero in on the rabbinical tradition.
Because that's where Jesus came from.
That was his background.
And it's so important for us to contrast how we often view discipleship today.
With how it was understood back then.
Because we often see it as this optional thing.
Right, like an add-on.
Something you do after you become a Christian.
Take your time.
And it's often confined to the church building.
Like a Sunday school class.
But in the first century,
It was way more than that.
it was life-altering.
It was about becoming a certain kind of person.
And if we want to see the church grow,
And multiply.
we need to recover this fuller understanding of discipleship.
Absolutely.
So when Jesus said make disciples, what do you think his followers immediately thought of?
Well, I think they thought about finding people
Yeah.
and developing them.
To be like them.
Exactly, to be like them.
Like deeply committed followers of Jesus.
That's what Paul believed.
And that's how she lived.
They understood that discipleship involved a radical commitment
To following Jesus.
and learning his way of life.
It was a complete transformation.
Okay, so what did this look like in practice?
What were the characteristics of first century discipleship?
Well, first of all, it always started with the decision to follow a teacher.
You had to
And the teacher could accept or reject you.
It wasn't automatic.
And back then, young men would seek out different rabbinical schools,
They were shopping around for a rabbi.
trying to find the best fit.
And if they hadn't achieved a certain level of scholarship by the time they were 13,
By their bar mitzvah,
they would usually go into a trade.
they become a carpenter or a fisherman,
And this helps us understand why Jesus and his followers were looked down upon.
because many of them were from working class backgrounds.
They weren't the elite.
They weren't the scholars.
And the disciple was expected to learn everything from his teacher.
Their stories,
Their habits,
their way of observing the Sabbath,
their interpretations of the Torah.
everything.
And the goal was that they would eventually teach others.
They would become teachers themselves.
So submission to the teacher was key.
It was the foundation of the relationship.
It was even considered stronger than the bond between a father and son.
Wow, that's powerful.
It was like a servant-master relationship.
But it was based on mutual respect.
And there were even different levels within this structure.
From beginner to expert,
Like you could be a Talmud,
which was a beginner
or a distinguished student,
or a disciple associate.
or even a disciple of the wise.
So there was a clear hierarchy.
Okay, so the first characteristic was choosing a teacher and submitting to them.
Right.
What was the second one?
Well, the second characteristic was memorizing the teacher's words.
Memorize.
Yeah, because they relied on oral tradition.
So everything had to be passed down verbally.
They didn't have printing presses.
So the disciples had to learn everything by heart.
They had to remember it perfectly.
So they could preserve it and pass it on.
And they would often memorize different interpretations of the Torah.
It was like a mental workout.
They were training their minds.
Okay, so they chose a teacher, they memorized their words. What else?
Well, the third characteristic was learning the teacher's way of ministry
Okay, how did they do that?
by observing him,
Watching him closely.
seeing how he lived out God's commands,
Like how he observed the Sabbath,
how he fasted,
how he prayed.
even how he offered blessings.
They paid attention to all the details.
We wanted to learn everything.
And they also studied his teaching methods.
And the traditions he followed?
So it was a holistic education.
They were being shaped in every area of life.
Okay, what about the fourth characteristic?
The fourth characteristic was imitating the teacher's life and character.
This sounds like the ultimate goal,
Yeah, it was the highest calling.
to become like your master.
And Jesus himself said that a fully trained disciple will be like his teacher.
So it's not just about learning information.
It's about transformation.
And Paul also talked about this,
He told Timothy to follow his example.
and he encouraged all believers to imitate him
He wanted them to become like him.
as he followed Christ.
It's a high standard.
But it's the goal.
And there's this story about a rabbinical student.
Yeah, what about him?
He was so dedicated to imitating his teacher
Okay.
that he hid in his teacher's bedroom.
Wow, that's a bit much.
Yeah, it is.
But it shows how serious they were about imitation.
They wanted to learn everything.
Even the smallest details.
They were completely immersed.
And what's the fifth characteristic?
The fifth characteristic is raising up your own disciples.
So it's about multiplication.
Yeah, once you've been trained
You're expected to go and train others
to pass on what you've learned.
and to start your own school or
The
following.
famous House of Hillel.
It's about leaving a legacy
So these 5 characteristics give us a pretty clear picture.
of what discipleship looked like back then.
And it makes sense that when Jesus told his followers to make disciples, they would have understood it within this framework.
Of commitment and multiplication.
So the big question for us today is, what does this kind of discipleship look like in our world?
In the 21st century.
And how common is it?
That's what we need to wrestle with.
Okay, so before we get to that,
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to look at what made Jesus' approach to discipleship unique.
Oh, because he was doing something different.
Yeah, he was building on the tradition.
But also breaking new ground.
So what was unique about it?
Well, for starters, the people he chose as his disciples were pretty unconventional.
They weren't the usual suspects.
Like, he didn't choose Gentiles.
Which was pretty radical for the time.
Yeah, because they weren't part of the covenant people.
And they didn't have the same understanding of the kingdom of God.
He also didn't choose Hellenistic Jews.
Those who were more influenced by Greek culture.
They were kind of caught between two worlds.
Yeah, they were trying to straddle the fence.
And as Doug Greenwald points out,
Yeah.
they weren't really sure what they wanted.
They wanted the benefits of both worlds.
But they weren't fully committed to either one.
So that left the observant Jews.
The ones who were deeply committed to their faith.
And their practices.
But even within that group, Jesus didn't go for the elite.
He didn't choose the Pharisees.
Or the religious scholars.
He went for the everyday people.
Fishermen, the farmers, the carpenters.
The working class.
And what's interesting is that these observant Jews,
Yeah.
they were really passionate about ritual purity.
They took it seriously.
They wanted to avoid anything that might contaminate them.
Like contact with the Gentiles or sinners.
Or people with leprosy.
They were very careful.
And they had a deep knowledge of the scriptures.
But their prayer life could be a bit ritualized. Yeah, sometimes it was more about the form than the heart.
But importantly, they weren't elitist.
No, they didn't look down on others.
It was mainly the Pharisees who did that.
Who thought they were better than everyone else.
So Jesus chose these ordinary people
With their passion and their hunger for God.
because they had raw potential
They were open to change.
and they didn't have religious careers to protect.
They were free to follow him wholeheartedly.
That's so important.
It really is.
And another thing that was unique about Jesus' approach
Mm-hmm.
was that it was based on genuine friendship and mutual respect.
Yeah, he treated his disciples like equals.
He didn't lord it over them,
He was humble and approachable.
and he constantly called out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees,
Their self-righteousness,
their love of power.
their need for attention,
He wasn't afraid to speak truth to power,
even if it got him in trouble.
and he told his disciples,
Yeah,
don't seek titles like rabbi or father or teacher.
because you only have one master,
Christ himself,
and you are all brothers and sisters.
equal in his sight,
And he said true greatness,
is found in serving others.
not in lording it over them,
And he stressed that his disciples should be raising up his disciples.
not their own followers.
It's not about building your own kingdom.
It's about building God's kingdom.
So there may be teachers and leaders.
But they're not masters,
They're servants.
and submission is voluntary,
It's based on love and humility.
not fear or coercion,
So the call remains the same for us today,
to follow Jesus.
and to make disciples for him,
Okay, so we've seen how Jesus chose unconventional people.
and how he treated them with respect and humility.
What else was unique?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing
Yeah.
is that Jesus redefined what it meant to be a disciple.
He took it to a whole new level.
Like on a basic level, the word disciple just means learner.
Someone who's being taught.
But in the first century, it also carried the meaning of follower.
Someone who is committed to a particular teacher or school of thought.
But Jesus took this idea even further.
He said true following requires submission.
To someone who can teach you how to follow Jesus.
It's not about going it alone.
It's about finding a guide,
A mentor.
someone who is further along the path.
Who can help you grow.
So this idea of solo discipleship
Where you just do your own thing.
and follow your own agenda,
It's not really what Jesus had in mind.
it doesn't align with his model.
So a true disciple,
Is someone who submits to another believer
in a healthy and accountable relationship.
for the purpose of becoming more like Christ.
So it's not about control or manipulation.
No, it's about mutual support and encouragement.
It's about helping each other grow.
And it's about becoming more like Jesus together.
So a fuller definition of discipleship might
Yeah.
be expert.